Yes, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. It is an honor to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to present our work. In the following minutes, I would like to talk about the functional neuroanatomy of the cerebellum in motor and non-motor functions. Specifically, what I will do is to review 3 old concepts in cerebellar functional neuroanatomy, and then from each of these concepts, introduce a novel idea that is derived from our findings in the lab. The first old idea, whoa, all right, going back. Okay. It is this arrow here, right? Okay, so the first old idea that I would like to review is the concept that there is a functional topography within the cerebellum. Different parts of the cerebellum do different things. However, in the neuroimaging world, we know that mainly from a group study of 9 subjects and 2 meta-analyses that are shown in this slide. The new data that I want to show to you today includes over 1,000 participants from the Human Connection Project. We looked at task activity data from both motor and non-motor processes, as well as resting state functional connectivity in the same group of subjects. The first new finding here is a confirmation in the largest data set analyzed to date that there is indeed a functional topography within the cerebellum. Some areas of the cerebellum are more involved in motor function, which is shown here in red. Other areas of the cerebellum are specifically involved in distinct aspects of non-motor processing, such as working memory shown in blue or emotion processing, which is shown in pink. The second old idea that I want to review is that there is a double representation of motor function in the cerebellum. We know that from neuroimaging experiments of task processing in motor function, showing this double representation of motor function in the cerebellum engaging lobules 1 through 6, as well as lobule 8 here. This double motor representation was also observed in classical electrical stimulation studies, which is shown here on the left, and even anatomical tracks, motor input and output fibers coming to and from the cerebellum also follow this distribution of 2 motor representations. And the new idea from this old concept is the following: could non-motor processes in the cerebellum also be organized in a pattern of multiple representations? And our data seems to suggest that this is indeed the case. When we looked at motor task activity shown here in these 3 rows at the left, we observed this known double motor representation in the cerebellum. But when we looked at non-motor task processing, we could observe a pattern of 3 non-motor representations within the cerebellum. We also looked at resting state functional connectivity that was calculated from cerebral cortical seeds that corresponding to the task activity peak of each of these task contrasts. And we could observe a matching overlapping pattern providing conversion validation for the fact that just as there are 2 motor representations in the cerebellum, non-motor processing seems to engage lobules 6 and cross 1, cross 2 and 7b, and lobules 9 and 10. Whoa. Yeah. Generating this pattern of 3 non-motor representations. Now, of note, first and second non-motor representations are sometimes contiguous, as shown, for example, here in language processing, and they are sometimes separate, as shown, for example, here in working memory. This distribution was already shown in a previous study by Wagner and colleagues and is consistent with, for example, a first and continuous second representation of the default mode network, shown here in red, contrasting with a first and separate second representation of frontoparietal network, shown in orange, each of these with their corresponding third representation in lobules 9 or 10. Now, the third old idea has to do with the cerebral cortex, not with the cerebellum. And the idea is that functions in the cerebral cortex are organized from more simple to more complex. This was reviewed in a now classical paper by Marcel Mesulam, where he described a functional organization from primary cortices all the way to multimodal association areas, with functions getting more and more distinct from primary unimodal processing as one progresses away in space from the primary motor, somatosensory, visual, and auditory cortical areas. This is the old idea, and the new concept from here is the following: what is the equivalent macro-scale organization principle within the cerebellum? We address this fundamental knowledge gap using a novel method of resting state functional connectivity data analysis called diffusion map embedding. Diffusion map embedding analyzes resting state functional connectivity data and extracts functional gradients based on the similarity between the connectivity patterns of all data points within a given brain structure. A previous study used this method of analysis on the cerebral cortex, and this is what they found. Here, gradient 1 shown in the y-axis The principal axis of macroscale organization of the cerebral cortex progresses from primary cortices shown in blue and green all the way to multimodal association areas shown in red. We were the first to apply this method of analysis in the cerebellum. And here, going from deep blue to deep red, this is how gradient 1 in the cerebellum looks like. If we compare gradient 1 with our previous task activity map in the cerebellum and we plot it here in the y-axis, in the scatter plot shown here at the left of the slide, we can see that gradient 1 goes from a motor task, here shown in blue, to a working memory focused cognitive processing task shown in green, all the way to a story listening unfocused cognitive processing task shown in red. If we compare this gradient 1 with a previous resting state parcellation of the cerebellum, we can observe a similar organization with gradient 1 going from somatomotor network shown here in blue to task focus, task positive resting state networks here in the middle, then all the way to this unfocused cognitive processing default mode network shown in red. And gradient 2 shown here and here in the x-axis seems to isolate focused cognitive processing, but the main message is that gradient 1, the principal axis of macroscale organization in the cerebellum, progresses from motor function to focused cognitive to unfocused cognitive function, very much like we can observe in the cerebral cortex. So I have told you now that there are 2 motor representations in the cerebellum, and I have told you that there are 3 non-motor representations in the cerebellum. And a very reasonable question to us would be why? Why would the cerebellum be organized in this way? And specifically, what is different between motor processing here, and then non-motor processing between here, here, and here? We know extremely little about this question in the cerebellar field. However, there seems to be an indication or a clue in clinical neurology. And the observation is the following. When a stroke in the cerebellum knocks out the area of the first motor representation, but not the second motor representation, motor symptoms are very prominent. There is very clear cerebellar motor ataxia. However, when a stroke in the cerebellum damages the area of second motor representation, leaving intact the area of the first motor representation, motor symptoms are very mild and sometimes non-existent. An interpretation of this pattern of deficits could be that we know that processing here is motor, and it might be that processing down here is somewhat less purely motor. And the hypothesis that I want to defend here is that the same logic might extend to the areas of non-motor processing within the cerebellum. Specifically, we know that processing here is unfocused cognitive, and it might be that unfocused cognitive processing down here is somewhat less purely unfocused cognitive. And similarly, we know that processing here and here is focused cognitive, and it might be that focused cognitive processing down here is somewhat less purely focused cognitive. And this idea comes from analyzing the relationship between our gradient-based approach to function in the cerebellum and these different areas of 2 motor and 3 non-motor representations. Now, if you look at the screen here in the middle and follow my pointer, we can look at a map of second motor representation, which is shown here in red and mapped here in red, if you can see it. Then we can look at a map of third non-motor representation of focused cognitive processing, shown here in red and mapped here in red, and then of unfocused cognitive processing, shown here in red and mapped here in red. And we can observe that second motor and third non-motor representation of focused and unfocused cognitive processing all seem to be located at a more central position in this gradient 1, gradient 2 space of cerebellar function. What we are seeing here is a hierarchical similarity that may reflect functional similarities between motor processing in lobule 8 and non-motor processing in lobules 9 and 10. We also looked at connectivity from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex, and that also supported this hypothesis. I do not have time to review this now, but you can read more about this in our preprint in bioRxiv. Now, this initial answer, of course, opens new questions. Future studies will need to analyze what is the functional relevance and significance of these differences and these similarities between these areas of motor and non-motor processing in the cerebellum in task activity, in cognitive neuroscience, or in clinical neurology. And I would like to thank my mentors and our funding organizations, and I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.